Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're diving into a topic that never seems to get old, especially in our digital age: censorship in the US.
It's true. Censorship has been making headlines for centuries.
But we've got a ton of research to get through today, so buckle up. This isn't just going to be a dry history lesson, though. We're going to uncover some seriously interesting stuff about censorship in America, from the very beginning to today.
Yeah, this is a topic that's always evolving, so understanding the history is going to be really helpful for navigating the censorship conversations happening right now.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation. I'm talking, of course, about the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, and so on and so forth, right?
Right, freedom of speech, religion, the press.
But get this, did you know that the First Amendment didn't always apply to state and local governments?
Well, it's true. In the early days of the U.S., the First Amendment was really seen as protection against federal overreach. The states had a lot more leeway back then. So for a long time, local communities could basically decide what people were allowed to say, read, and watch.
It's kind of a paradox, right? The amendment that's supposed to protect freedom of expression was initially really limited in its scope.
So like imagine a world where your city council gets to decide which books are allowed in the local bookstore.
Well, that was the reality for a lot of American history.
That's kind of wild.
It is, and it led to things like the whole banned in Boston phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Boston had a reputation for being particularly strict about what was considered acceptable. We're talking about major literary figures like Walt Whitman, even James Joyce. Their works were considered too scandalous for Bostonian eyes.
Wow. It seems kind of crazy now that a city could ban certain books.
Well, it's a good example of how censorship often reflects the anxieties and the power dynamics of a particular time and place.
So it's not just about silencing voices, it's about controlling the narrative.
Exactly. And that brings us to a very important figure in the history of American censorship: Anthony Comstock.
Comstock. Didn't he have something to do with banning obscene materials?
He was obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Totally fixated on stamping out anything that he considered vice, which was basically anything related to sex, even information about contraception.
So this one guy was basically calling the shots on what Americans were allowed to read and see when it came to anything remotely taboo.
He was a powerful guy. Comstock was responsible for seizing and destroying an unbelievable amount of material. We're talking about 15 tons of books, pamphlets, you name it.
15 tons. That's insane. That's like the weight of a small school bus, all because one guy was on a crusade against anything he thought was immoral.
And, the Comstock Law, which is what gave him all that power, stayed on the books for decades.
Wow. Okay, so we've got moral panics leading to censorship, but it wasn't just about morality, right? What about national security? How has that factored into censorship in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
National security concerns have definitely played a major role in shaping censorship laws and practices in the U.S.
Well, take the early 1900s, for example. The Sedition Act. People were literally thrown in jail for criticizing the government during wartime.
Right, and that's always a tricky balance, isn't it? Balancing free speech with national security, especially in times of war.
It is, and it makes you wonder about the line between acceptable dissent and what's considered dangerous speech.
It's a line that can shift depending on the circumstances. Look at the case of Father Charles Coughlin. He was this hugely popular radio priest back in the 1930s.
Oh, yeah, I think I learned about him in filigree class. Didn't he have a radio show during the Great Depression?
He did, and he had millions of listeners tuning in every week.
So what happened?
Well, his views became increasingly extreme, anti-Semitic even, and eventually he was forced off the air.
Forced off the air? By who?
It wasn't actually a government agency. It was a combination of pressure from the Catholic Church and the private broadcasting associations at the time.
So even private organizations played a role in censorship.
Absolutely. And Coughlin's case shows how complex these issues can be, with various groups and entities wielding influence over what people are able to hear and see.
So we've talked about government censorship and the role of private organizations, but what about corporations? It seems like they hold a lot of power these days when it comes to controlling information.
Oh, absolutely. Corporations have become incredibly influential in shaping the information landscape.
And it can be a lot more subtle than outright government censorship, don't you think?
It can be, yeah. We're not always talking about outright bans. Sometimes it's more about what doesn't get reported, the stories that just never see the light of day.
Okay, so you're saying corporations are essentially censoring information by choosing what to show and what to hide?
In a way, yes. And it often comes down to things like protecting their bottom line, avoiding controversy, or maintaining a certain public image.
That makes sense. Do you have any examples of that?
Well, one example that comes to mind is the lack of critical reporting on the 1996 Telecommunications Act.
The Telecommunications Act. Refresh my memory. What was that about again?
It was a major piece of legislation that had huge implications for media consolidation in the U.S. Basically, it allowed for fewer companies to own more media outlets.
Oh, right. I remember that now. So what does that have to do with censorship?
Well, critics of the law argued that it would lead to less diversity of viewpoints, giving corporations even more control over the information people were exposed to.
That's a good point. And was there a lot of pushback against the law at the time?
There were some dissenting voices, but the news coverage overall was surprisingly muted, given the potential impact of the law.
That's interesting. So are you saying that maybe some of the media outlets that might have been critical of the law were hesitant to speak out because they didn't want to bite the hand that feeds, so to speak?
It's possible. And that's the thing about corporate influence. Sometimes it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly where the censorship is happening because it's so diffuse.
Okay, so if corporations were already flexing their censorship muscles back then, the internet must have really shaken things up. I mean, when it first came about, everyone was talking about how the internet was going to be this great democratizing force, a place where anyone could say anything.
It's true. The internet did open up a whole new frontier for free expression.
But it also created a whole new set of challenges, right?
Exactly. It's this weird digital tug of war, right? Like, on the one hand, the internet has been amazing for free speech. Information can spread so quickly now, and people have a platform in a way they never did before. But that also creates new problems and makes some existing ones even worse.
Yeah, it's like giving a megaphone to everyone in a crowded room at the same time. Could be great, could be a disaster, maybe a little of both.
Definitely both. And that's where things like the DMCA come into play, right?
Okay, so the DMCA, that's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, if I remember correctly. It was all about stopping piracy online, wasn't it?
That was the main goal, to protect intellectual property in the digital age. But like a lot of laws, it had consequences that people didn't necessarily see coming. Consequences for free expression, especially.
You mean because people could share content more easily?
It's more than that. A great example is the case of Dmitry Sklarov.
Sklarov, who was that again?
So Sklarov was this Russian programmer who got arrested in the U.S. back in the early 2000s.
Arrested? What for? Like hacking into government systems or something?
Nothing like that. He wrote code, and that was his crime, basically.
Code? How can I get arrested for writing code?
Well, the code he wrote could be used to bypass copyright protections on ebooks.
Oh, I see. So he got caught up in this whole DMCA thing.
Right, and his case sparked a huge debate about whether the DMCA was being used to stifle innovation and legitimate security research. Like, where do you draw the line between protecting intellectual property and allowing for things like fair use, educational purposes, even just the free exchange of ideas?
Right. It's like, yeah, we want artists and creators to get paid for their work, but we don't want to lock down all information completely. So how does that work in practice? It's tricky.
Really tricky. And then, of course, there's the whole world of WikiLeaks.
Oh, man. WikiLeaks. Every time I hear that name, I know it's going to be something controversial.
Well, they're all about transparency, right? Exposing government secrets, holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, but they've also been accused of putting lives at risk, haven't they? I mean, dumping classified information online like that?
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. People have argued that what they do is a form of journalism, that the public has a right to know, but governments and intelligence agencies obviously have a different perspective.
It's a classic example of how the internet has kind of blown up the old rules about information control. Like, before the internet, if you wanted to leak information, it was a lot riskier and a lot harder to do.
And you were more likely to have a filter, someone deciding what got out and what didn't. An editor at a newspaper, maybe. That's all out the window now.
Okay, so we've got the DMCA, we've got WikiLeaks. What about Section 230? It seems like everyone and their mother has an opinion on Section 230.
Right, because it's a big one. Section 230 is essentially what allows websites and social media companies to exist the way they do.
How so? What does it actually do?
Basically, it says that online platforms aren't legally responsible for the content that their users post. So if someone posts something defamatory on Facebook, for example, it's the person who posted it who's on the hook legally, not Facebook.
That makes sense. Otherwise, these companies would be getting sued left and right all the time.
Exactly. And that protection has been crucial for the growth of the internet. But there's a flip side.
Okay, I think I can see where you're going with this. So what's the downside?
Well, critics argue that it's allowed all this awful stuff to flourish online. Hate speech, misinformation, you name it. And the people behind these platforms are basically off the hook because of Section 230.
So it's this big debate about where you draw the line between protecting free speech and preventing harm.
And it's a really tough one because there are valid points on both sides.
There are. It's easy to get riled up about, censorship and free speech, but when you start to really think about all the nuances, it gets complicated really fast.
It does. And these debates aren't going away anytime soon, especially with how fast technology is changing.
Speaking of which, here we are in 2024, and it seems like censorship battles are popping up everywhere we look. We're seeing book bans in schools again, which seems crazy to me.
It's definitely a trend, and it's concerning a lot of people, especially when you think about who's deciding what should or shouldn't be allowed.
Exactly. It feels like we're going backward in time. And then, of course, there's all the controversy about free speech on social media platforms.
Social media adds a whole other layer of complexity, right? On the one hand, these platforms have given a voice to so many people. But on the other, there's no doubt that they've also become amplifiers for all sorts of harmful content.
Yeah, so how do we deal with that? How do we even start to draw the line? It feels like every time someone tries to come up with a solution, it creates more problems.
There's a constant balancing act.
Right.
And it's something that societies all over the world are grappling with. I don't think there's one easy answer, but I think a big part of it is recognizing that this isn't a black and white issue.
It's so true. It's easy to get caught up in the slogans and the outrage, but there are so many gray areas. Something that seems like a clear-cut case of censorship to one person might be seen as totally justified by someone else.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to listen to different perspectives, and be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
It really is. And with all this talk about censorship, it can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes, to be honest. Like, where do we even go from here?
It is a lot, but I think one of the most important things we can do is pay attention to what's happening with book bans and these educational gag orders that we're seeing pop up.
You're talking about those attempts to remove certain books from schools and libraries?
Exactly. We're seeing a lot of this lately, and often it's focused on books dealing with things like race, gender identity, sexuality, the stuff that makes some people uncomfortable, basically.
It's like, haven't we learned by now that banning books just doesn't work? If anything, it makes people more curious, right?
It often backfires, yeah. Plus, it raises questions about who gets to decide what's appropriate for young people to read and learn about. Is it the government, parents, school boards? It's a tough one.
It is tough. And this whole debate about what's appropriate, it's not limited to books, right? I mean, look at what's going on with social media. People are constantly fighting about what should and shouldn't be allowed on these platforms.
It's another one of those areas where the internet has just completely changed the game.
Totally. Like, on the one hand, you have all these people who finally have a voice, who can connect with others and share their stories. But then on the other hand, you have all this misinformation and hate speech spreading like wildfire.
And figuring out how to deal with that, how to balance free speech with the need to protect people from harm, that's the million-dollar question.
It really is. Do you think there even is a solution?
I'm not sure there's a perfect solution,
Yeah.
but I think it starts with recognizing that this isn't a simple issue. We can't just slap a censorship is bad sticker on everything and call it a day.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Exactly. What might look like a clear-cut case of censorship to one person might be seen as completely justified by someone else. Context matters. Intent matters.
So basically, we need to be willing to have those difficult conversations, to listen to each other and try to understand different viewpoints, even if we don't agree.
Yes. And be wary of anyone who claims to have it all figured out. Because the reality is, this is something we're all figuring out together as a society.
That's a good point. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to circle back to this idea of self-censorship. The sources we read, they said that's actually one of the most insidious forms of censorship out there.
Oh, absolutely. It's the kind of censorship that flies under the radar because it's not always obvious.
So, like, even if there aren't any specific rules or laws in place, we might still censor ourselves because we're afraid of what other people will think, or because we don't want to rock the boat.
It happens all the time. People are afraid of backlash, of being canceled, of losing their jobs, so they stay silent even when they have something important to say.
That's scary when you think about it. That fear can be really paralyzing.
It can be. And that's why it's so important to fight for those spaces where people feel safe to speak their minds, even if what they have to say is controversial or unpopular. Because if we lose that, then we've lost something really precious.
I completely agree. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Censorship from the early days of the US all the way to the digital age. And honestly, I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
We've only just dipped our toes in, really. But hopefully this has given our listeners some food for thought, some things to consider as they navigate this increasingly complex world.
It definitely has for me. So, to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of censorship. We'll leave you with this thought: stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those conversations going. Because as we learned today, the fight for free speech, it's an ongoing battle, and it's one that we all have a role to play in.